In the sweltering summer of 1992, in a quiet corner of the Arkansas River Valley, the Wilcox family had been known for generations as hardworking, salt-of-the-earth cattle ranchers, their red barn and worn corrals a familiar sight off County Road 11. The Wilcox name carried weight in Boone County, mostly good weight. Folks remembered Harold Wilcox, the family patriarch, for his fair dealings at the livestock auction and the way he used to hand out homemade beef jerky at the county fair. But over the years, time weathered the Wilcox name as surely as it did the barn siding, and things began to unravel after the eldest son, Travis, was arrested in 1996 for running an illegal but highly lucrative livestock doping ring. The town was shaken. No one saw it coming. That same year, the rest of the Wilcox family, Harold, his wife Ruth, and their teenage daughter Ellen, vanished without a trace, leaving behind a table set for supper and a single lamp burning in the living room window. The sheriff's department, underfunded and overburdened, ruled it a voluntary disappearance at first, hinting the family had fled the shame of Travis's crimes, perhaps starting over out west. But locals whispered of more sinister theories. Something didn't sit right with the way the ranch was left, livestock still unfed, the dog still tethered by the porch, barking into the wind. For years, the property sat empty, slowly crumbling, slowly forgotten. That is, until recently, when Nora Dunn, a recently widowed woman of 61 and a cousin on Ruth Wilcox's side, returned to Boone County to settle back on her childhood land just a few miles from the old Wilcox place. With her grown sons off in Little Rock and no real ties left in the city, Nora had taken to tending her own small garden, walking the trails she remembered from her youth, and checking in on the few remaining neighbors. On one particularly dry morning in early June, Nora was strolling along the overgrown fence line near the old Wilcox spread, reminiscing about simpler days, when she noticed something strange, a patch of freshly turned earth near the collapsed northern shed, surrounded by half-dead thistle and wild oats. She wouldn't have thought twice about it, kids trespassed sometimes, but the ground was too carefully disturbed, almost square in shape, and the smell wasn't just loamy soil but something else, faint and sour. She returned the next day with her late husband's old army entrenching tool and a thermos of coffee, intending just to poke around for nostalgia's sake. What she uncovered, 6 inches below the topsoil, was a rusted steel lockbox with a broken hinge. Inside were several faded photographs, a scorched piece of cattle ledger paper, and a small, leather-bound notebook with T.W. scratched into the cover in angry, jagged letters. She stood there for a long time, fingers trembling. Travis Wilcox was still serving a 20-year sentence in Tucker maximum security. What could he have buried here, and why? That night, sitting at her kitchen table with a magnifying lamp and her old reading glasses, Nora thumbed through the notebook. It wasn't a diary exactly, more like field notes and brief accounts. Page after page documented dates, cattle weights, expenses, and then more cryptic entries. Keep Ruth away from the tanks, too much nitrate, and saw them again last night near the irrigation ditch. The final pages grew increasingly erratic. They're not watching just the livestock anymore. And the last line, smeared as if by tears or water, they'll come for them if I don't confess. Nora didn't sleep that night. The memory of Ruth, her quiet voice and kind eyes, filled her mind. Could this notebook be tied to their disappearance? She returned to the site the next morning and began scouring the area near the old irrigation tank. A child's bracelet, plastic stars strung on elastic, emerged from the dust like a ghost's whisper. She called the sheriff's office, but the young deputy on duty seemed disinterested. That case is 2 decades old, ma'am. Not much we can do now, he muttered. If you find bones or a body, give us a ring. Disgusted but not surprised, Nora took matters into her own hands. She drove down to the county archives in Harrison, spending hours going through old newspapers and land records. What she uncovered left her chilled. In 1995, 1 year before the Wilcoxes vanished, there was an article buried deep in the Boone County Bulletin about a water quality complaint near the Wilcox Ranch, high levels of nitrates in the well, reportedly causing illness in nearby livestock. The complaint had been filed, oddly enough, not by a neighbor or vet, but by Ruth Wilcox herself. The follow-up report was missing. Nora kept digging. She found references to a failed farm co-op that had briefly partnered with several local families, including the Wilcoxes, to sell high-grade beef to a regional distributor. The co-op dissolved in '95 amid rumors of corruption and under-the-table payments. One name kept appearing in those papers, Gus Penner, now a wealthy landowner with hands in everything from grain elevators to livestock transport. He was known for his immaculate boots and less than immaculate dealings. Nora remembered him, too, from her teenage years. Always too slick, always talking too loud. Her gut told her he knew something. That weekend, Nora paid a visit to her old friend Wally Price, who had once worked as a mechanic on the Wilcox farm. Now 72 and mostly blind in one eye, Wally lived in a trailer behind the VFW hall and still fixed small engines for beer money. At first he deflected. "Ain't my place to stir up ghosts, Nora," he grumbled. But over a few cans of root beer and some coaxing, he relented. He told her about the night Ruth came to him in tears, asking if he could help disable one of the big irrigation pumps. Said she was scared of what Travis was into, scared of who was coming by late at night. Wally had refused. Didn't want to get between blood. A week later, the Wilcoxes were gone. He hadn't spoken of it since. Nora drove home, her head spinning. The notebook, the water complaint, the land deals, it was all beginning to form a pattern. She took one more trip to the Wilcox property, this time with a flashlight and a spade. Near the edge of the old cattle paddock, behind the leaning windmill, she found a sealed PVC tube buried shallow beneath a pile of collapsed fencing. Inside was a damp manila envelope. It contained three things: a photocopy of a property deed signed not by Harold Wilcox but by Gus Penner, dated 3 weeks after the family disappeared, a blurry Polaroid of a man in a black hat standing beside what looked like a tanker truck near the cattle pens, and a torn corner of a child's drawing, a crayon sketch of a smiling family under a bright yellow sun. "Mom, Dad, Ellen, me," it read in uneven handwriting. Nora stood there in the fading light, the wind stirring the dry grass. Something terrible had happened here, and someone had gone to great lengths to erase it. She didn't know what she would do next, but one thing was clear. The early morning haze clung low over the fields like a secret that refused to lift, and Sheriff Louise McAllister, now 3 days into the missing persons investigation, stood in the middle of the now abandoned dairy barn that used to belong to the Callahan family. The cold in her bones was no longer just from the wind seeping through the cracked siding, it came from something deeper, something she couldn't quite name yet. As she shifted her weight onto the creaking boards of the loft where the teenager's jacket had been found, she replayed the testimony of the last person to see them all alive, Earl Dempsey, a quiet retired farmhand who claimed he saw the four of them loading up their Suburban just after dawn, heading toward the mountains for a reunion hike. But Louise had known Earl too long not to hear the tremor in his voice, the pause before he mentioned the direction they headed. Something was off, and the more she asked around town, the more she realized people weren't just confused, they were scared. One by one, she revisited the families of the missing, Eddie and Ron Doyle, half-brothers with a history of bad deals and moonshine runs in the 90s, John Keller, a laid-off irrigation contractor with ties to a failed co-op scheme in the early 2000s, and Sarah Green, a local librarian and the only one with a spotless record. Sarah's parents handed Louise a crumpled letter Sarah had never sent, dated weeks before her disappearance, talking vaguely about seeing something I shouldn't have and it's all tied to the Callahan land. That land, now overgrown and silent, had always been a point of dispute. Developers had tried to buy it out a decade ago for a biofuel experiment that was quietly abandoned, yet no one in town seemed to know why. Louise did what she hadn't done in years, she went into the county archives herself. Amid the dust and moldy maps, she uncovered a file labeled Agro Development Zone 11, Rejected Proposal. Inside were aerial photographs from 1998 showing the Callahan property with visible soil burn patterns, strange concentric circles in the field, too precise for weather, too structured for machinery. That same afternoon, she returned to the barn and called in a soil sample test, but before the results came back, her cruiser was vandalized. Someone had smashed the windshield and carved a single word into the hood, enough. That night, she sat in her living room, old logs crackling in the fireplace, looking at the evidence board she'd set up. It was the kind of thing she used to mock in crime shows, but now each pinned photo and note felt like a prayer for clarity. She'd circled the dates of every odd disappearance in the county over the last 40 years and found something chilling, a repeating pattern every 9 years, always in spring, always rural, always 4 people. The details varied, hikers, truckers, teens, even a schoolteacher once, but the spacing and number were exact. It wasn't coincidence. She started making phone calls, first to her contact at the state police, then to an old classmate who now worked in land surveying. Each person gave her a piece of the puzzle. That property wasn't just farmland, it had once been part of an experimental agritech facility that operated under a different name during the Cold War. When Louise traced the shell company, it led to a now-defunct branch of the Department of Agriculture tied to classified environmental trials, specifically, non-traditional biological containment studies. The deeper she dug, the more the pushback came. Her request to access the original reports was denied due to national security grounds. Her emails were bounced. Her house phone began receiving silent calls at night. And then, 2 weeks into the search, a hunter found the Suburban, burned out, deep in the Chattahoochee Forest, 100 kilometers from the farm. The vehicle showed no signs of a crash or natural fire. It was torched deliberately, with the same precise cuts around the VIN number as if someone didn't want it traced. There were no bodies. Just one item, a weathered notebook stuffed behind the rear panel. The cover read simply, KG 1973. Inside were pages and pages of diagrams, soil chemistry notes, mentions of biovector drift anomalies, and one recurring phrase, "They never left. They just changed." Louise sat in her truck for an hour with that notebook on her lap, wind shaking the tree branches outside, heart pounding. It was no longer a question of what happened to them. It was a question of what had been happening here all along, and why no one wanted it found. Sheriff Louise McAllister didn't sleep the night she read the notebook. The scrawl of KG 1973 looped through her thoughts like a whisper she couldn't shut out, and by dawn, she was back in the woods where the Suburban had been found. The site had been partially cleared by forensics, but something about it felt wrong, as if it had been staged to look chaotic while masking a precise purpose. She retraced the tire tracks, found the outline of a second vehicle parked nearby, and snapped photos of a rust-colored metal bolt half buried in the soil, unlike anything she'd seen in auto wreckage. She took it back to town and had it examined by the local mechanic, who swore it wasn't from any vehicle built after 1970. The mystery tightened. At the sheriff's office, she pulled the town's oldest public records again, and finally made a connection she had missed. In 1973, the Callahan property was briefly leased to a defense contractor, but only for 90 days, an anomaly in the otherwise spotless family ownership timeline. The contractor's name, Carriage Group, matched the initials in the notebook. She searched the term online but came up with nothing, until she found a brief mention in a declassified oversight hearing from the church committee, dated 1975. According to the document, Carriage had tested agrobiological stimuli for territorial repulsion, a phrase Louise couldn't decode until she looked at the soil test results from the Callahan barn, which had finally come in. The soil showed abnormally high levels of a long-band compound called DTX4, originally developed as a growth regulator. But this wasn't just a regulator, it was modified with compounds that could affect animal neurology and behavior. According to the report, long-term exposure could lead to hallucinations, paranoia, and dissociation in higher mammals. The pieces began to click. Maybe Sarah hadn't just seen something. Maybe she'd been exposed to something that changed how she saw the world. Louise returned to the greenhouse, asking again about Sarah's habits before the hike. Her mother mentioned that Sarah had recently been photographing old-growth trees near the Callahan land, trees that hadn't existed on survey maps from the 90s. Louise followed that trail. In the woods west of the Callahan property, she found a hidden grove, filled with trees that grew in unnatural spirals, their trunks warped like corkscrews, their leaves dull even in summer. At the center stood an old hunting shack, padlocked and sealed with boards covered in symbols, military stencils long faded but still legible. She broke in. Inside were sealed crates, one opened with a loud snap of old hinges, revealing rows of vials, all empty. On the wall, faded paperwork with the Carriage logo showed test dates spanning 5 decades. And then, near the cot, she found something that chilled her, a Polaroid photo of 4 young people, 2 men, 1 woman, 1 boy, standing beside the very same shack. Written on the back, Test Group D, Initial Exposure, May 3, 1973. The man on the far left looked like a younger version of Earl Dempsey. When she confronted Earl, he didn't deny it. He said only, "You were never supposed to find that place." Earl confessed that he was part of the original test, forced to sign lifetime NDA paperwork and paid off in monthly land maintenance subsidies from a company that didn't exist on paper anymore. According to him, the test didn't end in 73, it never stopped. Every 9 years, a new control group was introduced, unwitting locals sent into proximity with contaminated zones to monitor long-term environmental retention. "We thought it would fade out, but the land holds it. The forest, it remembers," he muttered. Earl said the last group, Sarah, Eddie, Ron, and John, had wandered too close to the secondary site, a deep basin hidden past the tree line, once used for runoff disposal, now camouflaged beneath the moss and debris. Louise geared up that night and went into the forest alone, guided only by the vague map drawn in Earl's shaking hand. She found the basin just before dawn, a shallow crater ringed by animal bones, the air heavy with rot and silence. In the center stood an old metal tower, collapsed inward, half buried in mud. She descended. Beneath the basin was a hatch, and inside, a bunker. The air was stale but breathable. Flickering lights revealed a laboratory frozen in time, jars of specimens, faded notes pinned to corkboards, decades of untouched equipment. And in one corner, for sleeping bags, all recently used. She stepped closer, her flashlight catching something on the wall, dozens of hand-drawn pictures. One of them was a sketch of her. Another was of the sheriff's office. Another showed the Green family home. Someone had been watching her for weeks. Then came the sound, a scraping, dragging step in the hallway behind her. She drew her weapon and turned. A figure stood in the shadows, backlit by flickering light. It was Sarah Green, but changed, her eyes distant, pupils too large, skin pale and dirty, voice barely a whisper as she said, "They're not coming back, Louise. I tried to keep them, but it's stronger now." Louise begged her to come out, but Sarah only smiled sadly and disappeared back into the corridor. Louise searched the entire complex, but Sarah was gone. No bodies. No signs of the others. Just one last item left for her on the cot, the same notebook, now containing additional entries in Sarah's handwriting. Cycle reset. Next phase begins 2034. Don't try to stop it. Louise emerged from the bunker as the sun rose, haunted and exhausted. She made her report, but it was sealed by federal agents within 48 hours. The site was bulldozed. Earl disappeared from his home. And Louise, now back behind her desk at the sheriff's office, pretends it never happened. But some nights, she hears static on her radio with voices whispering numbers. Every 9 years. 4 people. Always 4. In the spring of 2009, a college student named Jeremy Coltman from Des Moines drove into Willow County to write a thesis on forgotten surveillance projects of the Midwest. His research led him to a rumor buried in a 1982 edition of the Western Gazette, a short article describing strange containers discovered by hikers in the dead timber forest. The containers were confiscated and dismissed by authorities as military leftovers. Jeremy, curious and methodical, began digging through local courthouses and microfilm records until he found a name tied to the incident, Carriage Group. That name was scratched out in government memos, yet still visible on a permit ledger for soil testing near the Callahan property. At the same time, Louise McAllister, now 64 and just months from retirement, had grown quiet. For years after the incident with Sarah Green, she'd followed protocol, closed the investigation, and filed everything she could in a sealed evidence locker. But the whispers hadn't stopped. The static radio signals still came at night, same pattern, a long hiss, a short burst, then numbers. In January of that year, an unmarked envelope arrived on her porch. Inside were 4 photos, grainy stills from a surveillance camera showing a woman in the woods. It was Sarah. The timestamp was from only 2 weeks prior. Louise kept the photos secret. When Jeremy showed up in her office that April asking for permission to access archived incident files from 1973, she should have turned him away. Instead, she poured coffee, closed the blinds, and asked him what he knew about Carriage. When he answered, "I think they're still active," she gave him the key to the evidence locker. Over the following weeks, Jeremy scanned every file, photo, and map Louise had collected over her career. He digitized them, created overlays, timelines, and a 3D model of the Callahan forest terrain from 1973 to 2009. What they found stunned them both. Every 9 years, the disappearances followed the same geographic triangle, north of the river, west of the Callahan barn, east of the collapsed Firewatch Tower. The center point of every triangle was a clearing that never appeared on public survey maps. Jeremy and Louise drove to the site together that May. The clearing was quiet, overgrown, indistinct. They stood there for 2 hours, measuring radiation levels, GPS drift, taking samples. At 4:16 p.m., every device failed simultaneously, phones, Geiger counter, compass. For exactly 2 minutes. Then they all rebooted as if nothing had happened. That night, Jeremy posted a blurred photo of the clearing to an old conspiracy forum. Within 3 hours, his laptop was remotely wiped, and a black SUV was seen parked near his apartment. He went dark. Louise tried to call him for days. When she finally received a voicemail from him, it was 19 seconds long and filled only with static, followed by a whisper, "It's a loop." A week later, Jeremy's car was found abandoned at the bus station. His phone, wallet, and laptop were missing. But in the glove compartment was a sealed manila envelope with Louise's name on it. Inside was a USB drive containing his last mapped overlay. The drive showed a terrifying trend. In 2025, the triangle pattern would shift by 12 miles west, placing the epicenter directly under downtown Willow's residential area. The cycle wasn't just repeating. It was expanding. Louise brought the findings to state authorities. They listened, nodded, took her files, and 2 weeks later issued a statement blaming the missing student on mental health struggles and internet radicalization. The file was closed. Her phone line tapped. Her emails intercepted. That July, she retired early. But she didn't stop. Using a contact in the State Forestry Division, she obtained satellite imaging data from 1970 to 2024 and analyzed growth patterns. Overlaid on Jeremy's last model, the truth was clear: certain trees in the Callahan region weren't native, they grew faster, stronger, and aligned to form an invisible shape when seen from above. A spiral. At the center of that spiral was the original carriage bunker. But here was the most disturbing part: new satellite photos showed faint activity there again, tire marks, heat signatures, recently disturbed soil. Someone was back. Louise took her findings to only one person, an old friend at the university named Dr. Elliot Royce, a retired biochemist who had briefly consulted for agricultural firms in the 80s. He recognized the compound DTX-4 immediately. According to him, it was never meant for food production. It was a psychotropic behavioral control agent tested on animals in Cold War experiments to control migration patterns, suppress aggression, and enhance suggestibility. He believed it had mutated. When released into an ecosystem like dead timber, it didn't break down, it integrated. Louise asked what that meant. He replied, it's become part of the forest's memory. The trees, the soil, even the animals had become transmitters. Environmental data nodes. And anyone who spent too long near the core, like Sarah Green or the 1973 test group, risked permanent neurological contamination. They don't see the world the same way anymore, he said. Their minds are stuck in an echo. Louise asked what she could do. He only said, don't let anyone go back in there. But people were already going back. Every fall, hikers passed near the zone. In October, 2 high schoolers vanished near the old Callahan stream. Their bodies were never found. In November, a local hunter reported seeing a girl with no shoes, talking to trees. His camera captured nothing. His dog refused to return to that area. And now it was 2025. 9 years. The cycle was due again in October. Louise began building her own warning system: motion sensors, trail cams, ground temperature gauges. She set up an encrypted website where she uploaded everything Jeremy had found, along with her own recordings. But the site was soon taken offline. Her internet cut out. Her power flickered every evening at 2:17 a.m., same time the static came. And on March 19, she found a second notebook on her porch. New entries. Different handwriting. The first page said, "They're not lost. They're rewritten." That night, she stood on her back porch, looked at the forest's edge, and for a brief moment saw lights, blue, faint, spinning slowly through the trees. And the outline of 4 people watching her from the dark. She didn't move. She only whispered, "I see you too." The lights vanished. The air returned to normal. But the numbers didn't stop. 2025 was here. The loop was opening again. In the early hours of September 30, 2025, just as the first frost crept over the windowsills of Willow County, a power outage swept across 3 neighboring townships, blacking out more than 8,000 homes. On police scanners, strange bursts of static and broken phrases interrupted emergency communications: Delta return, inbound, clear passage. Simultaneously, forest rangers found all their wildlife camera feeds blanked out, their solar-powered batteries fully drained, some lenses cracked or melted as if hit by an intense wave of energy. Louise McAllister, now living under a pseudonym on the outskirts of town, watched it unfold in silence. She had anticipated this moment and had packed a single duffel bag with every document, photo, audio reel, and hard drive she and Jeremy had compiled. Her last recorded entry on the encrypted flash drive read, "If I vanish, it's because I followed the sound." Meanwhile, a new figure entered the story: Thomas Cale, a former military satellite technician turned private investigator. He had no prior ties to Willow County, but he had followed a trail of disjointed reports: missing hikers, psychotic breaks, wild radiation readings, and one image sent to him by an anonymous source, Sarah Green, standing barefoot in the woods, her eyes blackened like deep ink pools, her hair swaying as if underwater, time-stamped 6 days ago. His job had been to find digital anomalies, signals that slipped past the DoD's filters. But this? This was something else. His arrival in Willow was unannounced, and within 24 hours of checking into a motel under an alias, he found a plain white envelope taped to his windshield. Inside, a key, a trail map with several X marks, and a single note, "It remembers you too." Despite never being here before, he began dreaming of a spiral trail through trees, a clearing with no wind, and a voice that spoke backwards but sounded like his mother's. He followed the map. 2 miles into the woods, his GPS failed. His compass spun. But he kept going. At 4:17 p.m., he reached the clearing Louise and Jeremy had once stood in. It had changed. The soil was now slick, glassy. The grass was gone, replaced by a shallow depression filled with leaves that rotated slowly in a clockwise circle, though there was no wind. As he stepped in, his ears popped. A high-pitched tone flooded his head, and every sound around him, birds, branches, breathing, reversed in rhythm. The clearing was an acoustic mirror. In the center stood a rusted access hatch, the same one believed to have been sealed since the 1980s. It was open. Inside, stairs led down into a rusted corridor stinking of ammonia and iron. Thomas descended. Lights flickered on as he moved forward, triggered not by motion, but by some deeper recognition. He would later describe it as the sensation of being scanned without being touched. Inside were dozens of rusted consoles, reels of magnetic tape, and a wall of photos. All victims. Faces from 1973 to 2025. The final photo was of him. But the most disturbing part was a chamber marked ETAR. Inside was a chair, a headset, and a single phrase scrawled on the far wall in red marker: "She keeps them awake so they don't forget." He didn't sit. He backed away, documenting everything with a chest-mounted camera. But when he returned to the surface, the forest was different. The sun was lower than it should be. His watch read 5:04 p.m., but his phone said 7:19. Time had folded. In the distance, he heard voices. Not talking, chanting. 4 figures stood at the tree line, unmoving. One of them had no face. Just skin where features should be. When Thomas blinked, they were gone. He fled the forest, leaving markers behind. The next morning, he uploaded the footage to a secure server. By noon, the server was wiped, and his motel was empty. The maid said she found the sheets folded but wet, as if someone had melted into the bed. The only thing left was the duffel bag Louise had once packed, now in Thomas's trunk. And a new note: "You opened it." Back in town, a third figure emerged, Sheriff Dale Haskin, nephew of the original sheriff from 1973. He had always dismissed the stories as local folklore until his daughter, age 14, went missing for exactly 3 minutes during a family hike near the Callahan Ridge. When she returned, she was cold, silent, and her eyes were filled with tears she couldn't explain. She simply said, "They showed me everything." Dale reviewed every closed file his uncle ever handled. He found references to Black Pines Protocol, object looping, and echo reversion testing. All stamped with Carriage Group initials. Dale met with Louise in secret, showing her a cassette tape he'd found in his uncle's old safe. The label read, "Test Subject 5. Response, August 3, 1973. When they played it, it was 5 minutes of silence followed by a child's voice whispering, "I was never gone. I was rewritten." Then static. Then a phrase in reverse, "They still walk the loop." Louise played the clip for Dr. Royce, who confirmed the voice was Sarah Green at age 11, based on an old-school interview from 1972. But that wasn't possible, because Sarah had vanished in 1973. This tape was recorded after that. Royce believed the Carriage Group had found a way to isolate memory fields and store human consciousness like radio frequencies, looped through the environment using the DTX-4 compound. In effect, people didn't just disappear, they were copied, replayed, echoed. Some came back altered. Some didn't return at all. By October 5, the full loop was active. The forest pulsed. Wildlife fled the area. Roads near the site began to buckle, as if the land itself was rejecting its own topography. And then came the flood of sightings. Sarah Green was seen walking through a gas station at midnight. 3 men saw a woman with bleeding palms walking into a reservoir. A 9-year-old boy disappeared from his backyard, only to return 2 days later saying he had been with the whispering girl in the pine crown. He drew a spiral in charcoal over and over again. Meanwhile, a town historian uncovered that the carriage name didn't appear in official business registries, but it did appear in Cold War documents under the codename K-Return, a project authorized to test non-lethal civilian control through environmental resonance. Its methods were deemed unstable in 1984 and disbanded. Or so they claimed. The documents included a single hand-drawn map of Willow County. And in the center of the spiral, a house. No address. Just coordinates. When Louise and Dale followed them, they found it, an abandoned, 2-story house buried deep in the forest. It had no windows. Just a door, chained shut from the outside. Inside was pitch black. But as they stood there, both of them heard the same phrase inside their heads, "This is where she waits." Louise reached for the chain. Dale stopped her. They didn't enter. Instead, they backed away, leaving a trail camera hidden nearby. That night, the camera sent 3 frames before shutting off. The first showed the house. The second showed the door open. The third showed the camera lens cracked from the inside. Louise went silent after that. Dale tried to contact her, but her number was disconnected. Her house had been emptied, the locks changed. And in her mailbox, a single photo. It was the 4 missing hikers from 2001, standing in the Callahan clearing, smiling. But the photo had no timestamp. And none of them had aged a day. After that night when Ivan and Lesia emerged from the abandoned shed, they never returned to the village by the main road. Instead, they took the old forest path Ivan's grandfather used to speak about, a trail covered with moss, silence, and the kind of darkness that feels like memory. In the nearby city of Lviv, Lesia handed the USB drive to a journalist she trusted, one who had covered cases of police corruption before and had paid the price in threats and smears. 3 days later, the investigation was published online and in print, a deep dive into the disappearances, complete with photos, dates, audio excerpts, and partial names. Not all identities were revealed, but enough to rattle local systems. It didn't take long. The driver for the district prosecutor's office was arrested first, then the head forest ranger, then, shockingly, the deputy chairman of the regional council. The village went quiet. People avoided eye contact. Some stopped speaking altogether, while others began telling stories that had been locked away for decades. Ivan received a phone call from an unknown number, an older man claiming he had lived next to one of the boys who disappeared and that he had once seen a canvas-covered object being hauled out of the ground near the village's old water pumping station. Ivan drove there himself. He remembered the place, half swallowed by weeds, the rusted shell of a building leaning to one side. Behind it, buried near a cellar, he found remnants of the canvas. Underneath, a frayed rope. He called the police. What they dug up was incomplete but undeniable: personal belongings, fragments of IDs, fibers, a wristwatch. Meanwhile, a retired Interior Ministry officer, terminally ill, agreed to testify. In Kiev, behind closed doors, he described a group that had operated since the 1980s, removing undesirables for ideological reasons: addicts, rebels, whistleblowers, those who embarrassed the wrong officials. The operation was unofficial, underground, but tolerated. The 4 who vanished in the mountains? Some were related to earlier victims, some had stumbled on things they shouldn't have. Ivan was shown a list, over 30 names, some crossed out, others only nicknamed. But what shook him the most wasn't in an archive. It was a discovery Lesia made while packing her late mother's belongings in their family attic. In a weathered chest, hidden beneath blankets, she found one of her brother's school notebooks. On the last page, written in an unsteady hand, was a message dated 2003. "I heard them talking. They said I'm a risk. That I know too much. If I disappear, please find this note. I'm scared. Forgive me, sister." Lesia collapsed to the floor. When Ivan arrived, she handed him the book. They now knew her brother hadn't died during a trip or hike. He had been targeted. Betrayed by people he knew. Someone in the village. Maybe more than one. Days later, Ivan received a plain envelope in his mailbox, no return address. Inside was a black and white photo. 5 young men in military uniform stood outside the same shed where Ivan had uncovered the first tape. One of the men was his father. The others were unrecognizable, but they all wore the same grim expression. That photo changed everything. Ivan didn't tell Lesia. He didn't tell anyone. He burned the envelope in his kitchen sink, watching the image curl into smoke. But every evening after that, he would step outside, sit on the wooden bench his grandfather once made, and stare across the fields. He asked himself quietly, what if I hadn't come back? Would anyone else have found the truth? Or was it always meant to stay buried, in soil, in silence, in the crooked bones of this village that had seen everything, forgotten nothing, and never once spoken aloud?